Hello there. Um, I'm glad to be on here today. It's a bit of a impromptu live stream. I really wanted to get my thoughts out there while I still had them in my head. I really wanted to just, I don't know. Sometimes you find one of those types of videos that really inspire you, and you just have to get a response out there. And if you're a writer like me, um, that's it. Then you know that feeling. In any case, hello everybody. I'm glad to be seeing Elliot in the chat. I hope he sticks around. There's going to be a lot of interesting topics we shall cover here, or at least I will cover. Uh, Before we begin, I'll make a couple of announcements on and give you an idea of what future projects I'm going to be working on. First, I am just about done with the a response video that um, I'm working on into Hunter Avalon, and it's going to be about normalization and censorship and how that plays into a more ethical worldview, a virtue ethics position. And then and that's going to segue into a much larger project that I'm working on that's going to be about technology and the ethics of using computer technology in particular. So stay tuned for things like that in the future. I also am trying to get together with Christopher Lansdowne and with uh, I'm also going to be is trying to continue his conversation about with me about the idea of canon in fiction, and I also want to have a larger discussion with Todd Lewis again because we've recently started talking again after having not seen each other for a while. He has a lot of great ideas, and I really want to get them out there. And this is actually one of these ideas. So, um, recently, behind the scenes, I've been talking to Todd Lewis about what what we should be doing on the right. And Todd says, well, he quotes Lenin as saying we have to start from the commanding heights of metaphysics. In other words, we have to start with first principles. Because there's a lot of right wingers out there who think that we can just pick an aesthetic and just go at it without and try to fulfill that. And there's something inherently left wing about that kind of process. But I'm going to get into that in just a minute, in just a little while. Um, the entire thing with that I really wanted to get down to in this video, this could be a video about metaphysics, and it's also a video about ethics, and it concerns the neo-reactionary term called Gnon, spelled Gnon, and it's basically a shorthand for what you would call nature's God. Um, so what non is supposed to represent is a kind of it's kind of a form of natural law. Basically, it basically states that there are certain realities about the universe, and we ignore those realities at our own peril. Think of it as sort of the laws of Darwinian selection. For example, that's one of the examples of things related to non, right? If you have a group survival strategy that will lead to the undermining of the group, then you are going to see that group disappear and be mowed down in the by Gnon, the wrath of Gnon. For example, if you have a society where there are a lot of cheaters and liars and murderers, then that society is not going to last that long, and eventually it's going to collapse in on itself. That's the basic idea of Gnon in a nutshell, but there's a lot more to it than that. So I'm going to share my screen. There's a video that recently was made by a friend a friend of the channel called his name was White Tom. He runs a channel called Capturing Non, and he made a video named after his channel in which he talks about the concept of Non. And he said, and Non to him is typified by four blind forces of the universe that we have to respect in order to create a better society. The first is evolution, which is typified by the blind god Azathoth. There is the forces of mimetics, which is typified by Cthulhu. There's the forces of techno-capitalism, which are typified by Mammon, and there are the forces of war and violent competition, which are typified by Ares. And those who do not respect these four forces of Non are doomed to basically self-destruct. And the neo-reactionary critique of the liberal left is that they seem to think, the liberal left seems to think that they can just overcome these kinds of fundamental forces of evolution, mimetics, techno-capitalism, and war, sort of hand wave them away through as ideology or as something that can be overcome with technology, right? The idea is, we can ignore these blind forces that are arrayed to destroy us if we have the right social system. And the neo-reactionaries say that's sort of a pipe dream. The fact of the matter is, Azathoth will punish societies that do not practice certain sexual norms. That if you have a society that is very decadent in matters of sexual practices, then they'll fail to reproduce. If you have a society that doesn't have a formalized religious structure, then bad ideas will rise to the top. If you do not have a society that controls its marketplace, then the forces of the market will go out of control and ravage the community. And if you do not have a society that respects the martial tradition, then you will be destroyed by countries that are more physically strong than you are. You will be destroyed by a more warlike people than you. And so the answer to each of these, the way you capture Non, is let's see, and then you where was it? There, right. So you would have conservative patriarchy, that you would have a very socially conservative sexual outlook in order to control the forces of evolution and deal with the forces of evolution. You would have a rational theocracy to deal with the forces of mimetics, a controlled singularity to deal with the forces of techno-capitalism, and a kind of martial sovereignty, martial rule, in order to control the forces of war. So essentially what we are trying to So these kinds of blind forces of the cosmos, which are typified as these kinds of pagan or demonic entities, are what constitute non. Essentially, they are the forces that we need to respect and in some way capture in order to have a more human society. And the and the way that and he also cautions against while he warns against the kind of liberal view that we can just ignore these blind forces because our actions have no consequences. uh, White Tom also says that if we just follow these blind forces wherever they go, it will lead to something inhuman. And he uses the example of Anton Chigurh as a character from a fictional story, No Country for Old Men. This character, he says, typifies somebody who follows the will of Non perfectly. And this person is kind of a psychopathic killer, and yet he has this kind of he works according to some moral principle, and this moral principle accord is essentially the forces of fate, blind fate. He kills according to he flips a coin to decide if his victims are going to die or not, for example. It is the force. He basically represents these kinds of blind cosmic forces that are arrayed against humanity and are only held back by human civilization. If we do not respect civilization and respect non, then we will end up with more people like him, people who just follow the will of non deterministically, blindly, and to the detriment of all, including themselves. Tom points out at the end of this movie, Anton gets randomly hit, crosses a road, and then randomly gets hit by a truck, and he is only saved through the generosity of a couple of neighborhood boys. And Tom points out that the more people like Anton, there are in society, the less likely there will be people like those generous boys who will save the Antons from the chaos and destruction that occurs. So Tom's view is actually rather nuanced. We do not want to follow the will of non, and neither do we want to ignore it either. Rather, what we have to do is create civilize create civilization. We have to create institutions that will channel these blind forces into a pro-civilizational direction and a more human direction, frankly. He points out that the forces of Non do not care about humanity, and following the forces of Non will basically get rid of what makes us human, which he identifies as things like goodness and beauty, nobility. Um, and so that's White Tom's kinds of views on things. That's what he's trying to. That was how he set out to explain the reactionary view of non. Now, what are we to make of this? What are we to? How are we to describe this kind of thing? So, in response to this kind of view, I think it's helpful to compare this neo-reactionary view to the more classical traditional view of things, which is represented by people like Aristotle and St. Thomas in the Western tradition in general. So what the video's author, at the beginning of the video, Tom, the video's author, he goes into a talk of how Gnon differs from conceptions of natural law. And what he fails to recognize, however, is the difference between the Enlightenment view of natural law and the Thomistic view of natural law, which was found in a kind of prototypical form in ancient pagan philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. So the kind of classical view of nature is one in which there is meaning and purpose built into it. There, as Aristotle says, no agent acts in vain. Nature does not act in vain. There are wider purposes to the different things that occur in nature, right? A bird has a bird's purpose is, a bird's nature is to fly around and collect foods for its young so that it can survive and reproduce. Much the same with other animals and other plants. And the different and the natures of the cosmos, the purposes of the different planets and stars are to pull each other together by which is something that's described as the law of gravity. And it's this kind of purposeful view is sort of contrasted with the purposeful and meaningful view is contrasted by the kind of Enlightenment deistic view that someone like the American founders, like Thomas Jefferson, would have said. When the American founders spoke theistically of nature's God as the source for all our natural rights and the social contract, what they meant by nature was the Newtonian machine of closed and fixed laws, and what they meant by God was the God so understood as the kind of divine architect, this intelligent designer of a machine, and whose reality only extended as far as universal reason can discern. This is very different from the kind of Thomistic view that these people explicitly rejected at times. There are writings I can cite in which Thomas Jefferson actually rejects the view that there is anything immaterial. He actually says that anything Platonic or immaterial, he is just fancy words for nothing. So he was basically he basically had the attitude of a new atheist. The only difference is he believed in an intelligent designer. So you have this kind of tradition. So in this framework of nature, the traditional views of religion become trivialized and marginalized and relegated to the realm of private taste. And in its place rises this kind of vulgar, pragmatic empiricism, and there and from the and interestingly enough, the concept of non actually sort of arises from this uh, Enlightenment deism, right? Because once you see the universe as just a clockwork machine that God can just wind up and then step back and it goes on its own, at a certain point you find it's not that much of a leap to go from that to just saying that it was just blind forces that caused this. Going from the God of the Enlightenment, the deistic God, to Azathoth, the blind, stupid God. the blind idiot God that H.P. Lovecraft talked about. And, God is totally superfluous in this framework. And this is why liberalism sort of excludes God in all questions of metaphysics and goodness and beauty from the political world. Because the political world deals with the practical, and there's nothing practical about these things in the minds of the liberal. Not so with the God of, not so with theistic persuasions of the past. Not so with classical theism. So, I want to make an argument for why these classical liberals types who claim that goodness and beauty are totally subjective and unnecessary to practical affairs is wrong. And I think, and I was actually writing this before I saw Capturing Gnon, and I want to thank Tom because he made this argument for me in the midst of his video, maybe without even realizing the implications of it. All right. So, and to make this argument for aesthetic and moral realism, I'm going to analogize this argument to another argument from philosophy of science called the no miracles argument. So, in philosophy of science, there are competing views of what science actually is. And one of these views is instrumentalism, which is the view that science actually does not tell us anything true. It only tells us things that are useful for and things that give us these kinds of fancy toys and gadgets and gizmos. Sorry, I need to get up. Anyway, so instrumentalism says that science doesn't give us any true knowledge. It only gives us ways of manipulating the world. And this is contrasted with scientific realism, which is the view that science does give us real information, that the unobservable entities proposed by science are actually real and not mere useful fictions. And the main argument for scientific realism is called the no miracles argument, which goes something like this. So, scientific theories that exhibit these kinds of impressive predictive and technological successes, and if they and since they do exhibit these technological and predictive successes, and they posit these kinds of theoretical entities. Well, this is exactly what we'd expect if the theoretical entities were real, right? If the theoretical entities were not real, then it would be a total coincidence, a complete mystery why these scientific and technological theories just work, right? It would be ridiculous to it would be ridiculous. And an instrumentalist might respond by saying, "Well, the we have science works not because it's real, not because it gives us true information, but because it helps us in a kind of Darwinian sense." But the scientific realist would reply, "Well, okay, but how does that actually explain anything really? Because if how does it actually help us survive in a Darwinian sense if it isn't helping us understand the real world in some way?" And it doesn't now this doesn't mean that every scientific theory is true, obviously, but what it does mean is that science is aimed at truth and not merely at discovering ways of manipulating the world so that we can survive in a Darwinian sense. So I want to make an analogy from that, this kind of no miracles argument, to an argument for the realism of value judgments. Value judgments, in short, are judgments about the goodness or beauty of a thing. If I say, oh, that painting is beautiful, that's a value judgment. If I say murder is wrong, that's a value judgment. All right. And so the question is, are these value judgments, which presuppose entities like goodness and beauty, are these real entities? Now, a liberal would, and presumably white Tom would say, no, there is no such thing as goodness or beauty. It's all in our heads. Now, but hold on, because these value judgments are necessary for human flourishing. And the Capturing Gnon video makes it very clear that we need these kinds of value judgments. We need these kinds of aesthetic and moral judgments in order to flourish as human beings, in order to be fully human. Now, if this weren't the case, if it weren't the case that these entities were real, then it would be complete mystery as to why humans needs deposit these useful fictions in order to survive in the real world, right? There must be something real about these entities, this goodness and this beauty, in order for these value judgments to help us. And you can't just say, well, it just helps us survive, but because, as Capturing Gnon stated, as White Tom stated, if we follow the blind path of Gnon, if we follow Anton Chigurh, we'll end up like Anton Chigurh, and we'll end up destroying ourselves and our society at large. So it's not as though this kind of thing is this kind of appeal to evolution as a way out of this doesn't work for the no miracle arguments for value judgments either. So we have to conclude that things like beauty and goodness are real entities, and they really do exist in the world, because otherwise our flourishing as human beings would be a miracle. All right, and it would just be one big cosmic coincidence, and that is highly implausible, let's just say. So I'm going to move from that into a discussion of how this fits into St. Thomas and his view of God. Now, St. Thomas did not see divine causation as being incompatible with natural causation. He believed that all natural causation was concurrent with divine causation. That is to say, just because God caused something doesn't mean that it didn't have a natural cause too. Or just because something had a natural cause doesn't mean that there isn't also a divine cause to it. An example he would give, an example I'll give, and now as an analogy, imagine an author writing using a red pen. The pen is responsible for the letters being read, but the author is responsible for there being any writing at all. Similarly, natural causation is responsible for all the things that happen in the natural world, but God is responsible for there being any natural causation at all. God's causation is not a one and done thing, contra the deists. He didn't create the universe and then sit back and watch it move. To say that the universe can operate without God would be like saying that a pen could write without someone holding it. This is the concurrentist view of causation, which is the middle ground between occasionalism, where there is no natural causation, God causes everything by himself, and mere conservationism, wherein God creates something and then sits back and lets it work by itself. God's Now, God's existence can be proved in several ways, but the argument that I really want to focus on right here is one of St. Thomas's arguments, the fourth way, the argument from grades of perfection. This argument states that the beauty and goodness of the world cannot be explained without reference to something that was beauty and goodness itself, aka God. Beauty and goodness themselves cannot be reduced to any material thing or collection of material things. Any material thing is going to have features that are not good or beautiful, and having goodness and beauty does not entail having goodness or beauty does not entail being any particular material thing. And also different things have different degrees of goodness and beauty. If goodness and beauty were a mere property of an individual thing, then there's no reason why it would have such things in an unlimited way. Each human is fully human, because if they were not so, they would not be human at all. But no human is fully good or beautiful, so they cannot be identified with goodness and beauty itself. Therefore, beauty and goodness cannot be reduced to anything material. And neither are these things purely mental entities either, because there are certain facts about goodness and beauty that we can know, such as murder is wrong or symmetry is attractive. Were this not the case, then we'd have to explain how value judgments can lead to human flourishing without them referring to anything real in the real world, which is something that I addressed earlier with my no miracles argument. If goodness and beauty are real, but not a part of any real material thing, then the things of this world must derive their goodness and beauty through something else. Some immaterial, infinitely good, infinitely beautiful entity must be the cause of the limited goodness and beauty we see in our everyday lives. And if such an entity does exist, then why wouldn't we call it God? So I think that uh, I think that now that we've laid out the three positions, the kind of NRX neo-reactionaries, the kind of religious traditionalists, and the classical liberals, right? Once we've laid out these views, we can see the similarities between and differences between them. So the neo-reactionaries believe that aesthetics and beauty, art and goodness are not natural, but we ought to govern society according to such things because they lead to human flourishing. Traditionalists would agree that governing society according to goodness and beauty will lead to human flourishing, but we would say that this is why those things are real. And the liberals would say that, such things are purely subjective and they're irrelevant to governing well. All we need is science, right? And so what we have is a strange situation where the reactionaries who believe in Gnon, agree with the liberals that beauty and goodness are mere mental constructs. But then they believe that such constructs ought to be obeyed regardless because it leads to better outcomes. And I think this comes from the neo-reactionaries ultimately being liberal or leftist, insofar as they believe that imposing one's arbitrary will onto a blind, unintelligent nature is how one operates. And this is this sort of fundamental leftism of neo-reaction. Because if you look at the difference between how more traditional societies view the world versus modern liberalism, at the core of modern liberalism is the view that one can just impose their will onto the reality and control it and use it to forward some kind of technological end. whether it be just maximization of pleasure or fulfilling some goofy aesthetic vision, like like the solar punk movement, uh, or whatever. And this is part of a large part of the reason why the liberal modern left ignores the forces of Gnon is because of this view. They believe that they can conquer nature to such a degree that they can ignore evolutionary forces, they can ignore mimetics, they can ignore capitalism, they can ignore war, and they don't really need to care about these things. They believe that we can just conquer these blind forces and wield them to our benefit entirely without any kind of restraint. And this simply has not. Uh, and I think the neo-reactionaries are sort of a reaction to this kind of optimism in saying that no, we have to respect these forces. We have to respect them. There are consequences to immorality, and once we recognize that, then nothing. We can't just permit anything. We can't just have this kind of liberatory attitude towards things. And so I think the going forward, the right wing would need to understand that goodness and beauty are part of a natural order that God created, and there aren't and that these kinds of blind forces of evolution and what have you, they're not all that reality reduces to. There is something that these things presuppose, and these things presuppose the order of goodness and beauty and truth. And we ought to live our lives in accordance with these things and to the best of our ability. Because although we are not perfectly good, we are not although we are not perfectly beautiful, we ought to live in such a way that we pursue these things, because that is how we become fully human. All right. I think I'm done with this kind of impromptu presentation. I'd like to look at the chat and see what some of the things that you guys were saying, because there's a lot here. All right. So Computing the Soul says, it'd be cool to see something on the emergent properties attitude some people take on forms and immaterial things, and how this violates the law of identity by making properties come out of nowhere. Yeah, I mean, this is exact. I mean, this kind of reductionist view is common to modern scientifically minded people. Uh, and to give a good example of how stupid this is, once I had a conversation with a college teacher, a professor of mine. He was not a science professor, mind you. He was an English professor. So take that what you will. But I got into a conversation with him about metaphysics. And he told me that there was nothing but blind cosmic forces and the atoms that are just bouncing around. Kind of atomistic view of things. And I responded by saying, look, right, there are real entities that exist above the atoms, and the actions of these blind forces wouldn't make sense unless we take into account things like substantial form. For instance, the and so I pointed to this a lamp in the room, and I said, look at this lamp. It has properties that the materials that make it up would not have on their own, but only by coming together. This shows that the lamp is a real entity that exists over and above the parts that it's made of, It can't be reduced to those parts. And in response, the English teacher said, there is no lamp here. There's just a bunch of molecules. And that's sort of the reductio ad absurdum of this. And once I pointed that out, he literally started convulsing and just repeating over and over, this is the science, this is the science, like a man possessed, because he didn't have any kind of argument against this. This kind of reductionist attitude is a mere prejudice. There's nothing rational about it. And like you said, it violates the law of identity by making properties come out of nowhere. uh, if we want to say that lamps are real, then we have to reject reductionism and go for a more Aristotelian, holistic view of reality that recognizes that wholes exist over and above parts. And that's where these quote unquote emergent properties come from. All right, so that's my idea of this. And I really want to let's see what else. I don't like those four. I think it takes in way too many philosophical assumptions for granted. That's a fair critique of it, but I think to be fair to the neo-reactionaries, I think what they are pointing out, like I said, they're a reaction to this modern left assumption, this kind of techno-optimism that we can just ignore these blind forces because science has let us overcome them. And the neo-reactionaries are saying, well, actually, these kinds of blind forces are still very much in play. And if you ignore them, you do so at your own peril. And the way you overcome these blind forces is through these kinds of traditional institutions like monogamy or religion or what have you, right? That's how you overcome these things. And thinking you can just ignore them is utopian. And I think there's Joseph Gibson, way off topic. I'm wondering about fictional names like in the Cthulhu mythos and how they relate to actual demons. Well, I mean, they're pretty demonic looking according to the art. But more to the point, they are these kinds of transcendent entities that are beyond human comprehension, yet are not benevolent creatures. So what can we call those things other than demons, right? That's how I would defend my casting of things like Azathoth and Cthulhu as demons. Yeah, they might not be real. I mean, they might not be real entities, but they are certainly demons within the realm of Lovecraft. Even if Lovecraft prefers to depict them as kind of alien creatures because of his atheistic priors. But really, what that capturing non video was trying to get at is that these are embodiments of blind forces in the cosmos that we have to contend with and build up civilization in order to capture them, in order to better because if you just ignore them, then you do so at your own peril. All right, so yeah, the gods of the Gentiles are demons, right? It's exactly, and for all of his Puritan ancestry, I mean, Lovecraft was a kind of Gentile. He was creating new gods to replace the kind of Puritan god that his ancestors worshipped. All right, and I'm seeing this. Would it make sense to pick more fundamental laws? That's a good point there. Maybe that might be a side. That's sort of a side issue than what I was trying to get at. It's true that the four forces that he presupposes, that he lays down as fundamental laws, fundamental aspects of non. It might not be exhaustive, but there might be something more fundamental than that. I mean, if you're an atheist, you would think that something that's more fundamental than those four forces are just the blind laws of mechanistic reality. And if you're a theist like myself, or you are more in the classical persuasion, then you believe that there is this natural law that the natures of things leads to certain outcomes, and that is what is behind these forces. I mean, I can explain. I think I could give a good account of these four forces according to classical theism and the kind of perennial philosophy, if you'd like. But if I don't think a real classical philosophical view would see these four forces as foundational, like you said. I think we would see God as foundational, and then we would talk from God to the natures of things. We would talk about the natures of things in our world, the nature of humanity, the nature of society, the nature of goodness and beauty itself. All right. I think that's all. We've had 45 a better example would have been water. Lamp is an artifact, but water is an essential form. Yeah, I know, but you have to admit it's kind of silly how this guy was saying that the lamp that was by his desk did not exist because it was just a collection of molecules. It's inherently, it defies common sense how one can view reality like that. In any case, I'm going to let you guys all go. White Tom, I hope you watch this video sometime. I think it'll be very useful for for starting this discussion between reactionaries and the more religious conservative crowd. And I think that it would highlight some of the areas we have in common and how we could possibly have a meeting of minds. And I also invite you onto my channel again. You can contact me on Telegram and see if you want to visit me. It's going the My Telegram account is linked on my channel. So if you want to contact me there, please do so. All right, everybody. God bless and Ave Maria.